Marcy, if you'll hit record. Thank you very much. All right, so welcome folks. My name is Nicole Smith. I am the Land Steward Education Program Assistant. And Marcy, if you'll still let folks in from the waiting room for me, that would be awesome. You can find my email here at nicole.smith@oregonstate.edu. If you have questions or class ideas, you are welcome to send them this way. Pretty much have all of our classes scheduled through February of 2026. And so our education committee run of all the land steward volunteers has been hard at work to find topic ideas and folks to teach those topics all the way through the year. If you would like to keep in touch and hear about upcoming classes, you can go to Land Steward Program of, I believe, Land Steward Program, and it'll take you to this screen here where you can hit subscribe. And then we don't spam you with a bunch of stuff. We send out a couple times a month what classes are coming up, a reminder, and then our Land Steward newsletter quarterly. And when we have a new Land Steward coordinator, and we offer training like the Land Steward Program training or hybrid trainings, those will go out via our MailChimp. So that's what the subscribe button subscribes you to. If you type into Google Land Steward Program events, takes you to this page, and it shows upcoming events. Here we are, April 2nd, removing invasive species. Coming up at the end of April, we have a in-person class, wildfire resilience, managing your land and protecting your property in a wildfire environment by Miranda, and that will be held out in the Rouge area. And then I also included a few other events. There's one, a forest weed management field day in Oregon City, and then a drip irrigation also at the Extension Center here. So you can click on each of those links and learn a little more about those classes and sign up. And so it'll also share broader events going on through OSU. And why we are all here today to hear from Caleb about removing riparian species, invasive species in a riparian area, and strategies and permitting in it. Caleb's presentation goes far beyond just removing them, but also what you do afterward and in preparation. And Caleb Galloway is originally from St. Joseph, Missouri, and has been living in Southern Oregon for 16 years. Since 2020, he's managed riparian restoration for the Applegate Partnership and Watershed Council. And I was fortunate to meet Caleb, I believe last year, is that correct? Or maybe a little earlier than that, during our hybrid class. And Caleb offered a site visit at Cantrell Buckley to showcase the restoration work that has been going out there in various areas and some burn areas. And so we wanted to invite Caleb back to give a Zoom presentation for you all to continue talking about removing invasive species. So Caleb, I am going to stop sharing my screen so you can take over. And thank you so much for joining us.
Awesome, thank you. So I'm gonna share my screen first here. So first off, I want to thank everybody who is interested in our riparian areas and trying to better them and our ecology as a whole. It's really amazing that there's been a lot more interest in these areas lately and a lot of confusion surrounding on what and how to treat them. So thank you all for being here, and I'm excited to give this presentation. So as said before, my name is Caleb Galloway, and I'm the Riparian Restoration Manager for the Applegate Partnership and Watershed Council. Our Watershed Council manages many ecological improvements across the Applegate watershed, which is approximately 500,000 acres. And that stems from doing large wood debris in the rivers, removing dams, improving irrigation, doing restoration, fire mitigation and fuels reduction, and along with a lot of outdoor education for local students and schools and stuff like that. What we'll be discussing today is removing invasive species from riparian areas. We're going to mainly focus today on blackberry, and I want to preface that we're going to be talking about mechanical treatments. As the Applegate partnership, we do not use herbicides in our treatments, so this is going to be entirely about mechanical treatments. For more information on the use of herbicides, there are other resources that you can seek out. So to begin with, what is a riparian area, right? So we're talking about riparian areas, and it comes to that, maybe we don't even know what we're talking about. So a riparian area is essentially the transition zone between water and land. And areas include rivers, streams, lakes, ponds, large bodies of water. Riparian areas are generally a smaller area on the ecology as a whole, but even though they're small in stature, they provide a lot of ecological resources and benefits to everything. So, we all need water. So typically in at least the Applegate and generally the Rogue Basin, there's a few nuances across the way. This is a typical setup of a riparian area here in Southern Oregon. And so we can see we have our emergent grasses and wetlands, our upper upland species such as snowberry and Oregon ash, while we have mock orange, red alder, red osier, dogwood, and other species kind of closer to the waterline. So just to give you an example of a general riparian. So here are two actual riparian areas, and these are taken at the Provo Recreation Site and over at Cantrockley, and they're just to demonstrate a riparian area. And so we can see that essentially it's the transition between the water and the land. So these are small areas, like we said before, typically up to maybe 75 feet in certain water bodies in our area. So that doesn't seem like a lot, but our riparian areas are extremely important. So aside from they provide diverse plant communities as a transition zone to our uplands. So a lot of things like essentially a mosaic structure and differences in change. And our riparian areas act as a nice little oasis away from the drier, more arid uplands or even the water of itself. And so all of our species will use that at some point in their life, whether it's to get resources, to den, to get water, to get food, and a variety of different things. Along with that, our riparian areas act as filters. So the roots in the soil, which they hold back, will help filter pollutants out, such as the tannins from our oak trees, and even certain pollutants that are caused by us. Whether it's a little bit of oil or just different varying household and human-made pollutants. Having a healthy riparian zone will at least help to reduce that from getting into our water systems. Along with that, aside from shading our soils so they don't dry up, our riparian areas act a lot like a sponge. So when you have a healthy, intact riparian area, the ground will actually store more water throughout the drier summer months, so our trees are less stressed to the conditions when we are in our dry summer period before the winter rains. And then finally, our riparian areas also prevent sediment loss. So along with those roots and soils acting as filters, the roots will hold back our soils and kind of act like a belt, kind of like how you hold up your pants. The roots on our stream banks kind of act like a belt to hold up the soil. And we don't want things like soil running into our water because we have species that are sensitive to different variances in our river. And so we're going to go into that now. So forest and fish connected in Southern Oregon. So I'm just going to give a term real quick in case nobody's familiar with it, and that's anadromous fish. And so that's essentially fish that were born in freshwater, travel to the ocean to grow, and return back to the freshwater to die. Our species would include like coho salmon, chinook, steelhead, and Pacific lamprey. And so why is that important? So in our area in Southern Oregon, geologically speaking, we're not that old. So our soils aren't quite as developed as other areas of the country. And because of that, we lack certain micronutrients and different minerals that would be available for our forests. Well, because of things like our anadromous fish, they, when they go out to the ocean, gather those important micronutrients. And when they return and they pass away and go through the food chain and different various levels of decay and transition to the forest, that's how we get a lot of our forest after millions of years of those fish going out to the ocean, coming back, and completing the cycle. And so if we lose our healthy riparian areas, then we lose suitable habitat for those important species. And then if we lose those important species, we're likely to have a struggling forest. So it all kind of ties back into itself. That's why when we're talking about our riparian areas, we have to go through a permitting process. There's a lot of reasons why we want to ensure the best outcome from projects that are taking place in the riparian zone. So our fish are sensitive. Species such as salmon have very specific needs for survival. They're really sensitive to higher water temperatures. So our riparian areas, if they're lacking an overstory canopy, like big trees such as cottonwood, alder, maple, ash, well, that increases the amount of direct sunlight on the water, increasing the water temperature. And so if the water's too warm, our salmon won't come upstream. And once again, that'll eventually affect our forest because then we're not getting those nutritions and we've kind of broken the cycle. Likewise, sediment loads, fertilizers, and other pollutant runoffs will increase the water temperature. They'll reduce dissolved oxygen in the system and overall reduce the habitat quality, making it additionally unsuitable for our sensitive fish species, along with our species that use the riparian area as a whole, otter, beaver, we have ringtails. There's all sorts of different animals that utilize these areas. And having them healthy and intact leads to a better, more balanced ecology as a whole. So invasive, well, what is an invasive species, right? And why are we wanting to tackle some of these plants? Their vegetation, they seem sometimes like they might be providing some sort of ecological function. But I just wanted to get into why certain things are invasive species over other things. So essentially, an invasive species is a non-native or introduced species that has negative effects on native plant communities as well as local economies. So there's a lot of invasive species that are toxic to livestock or people and different things like that. Additionally, invasive species will outcompete our native species in a lot of different ways. They'll, like with invasive annual grasses and other species, they'll germinate and sprout sooner than our natives that are in that area, which means they have the opportunity to gain more sunlight to shade out our natives and also to gain those limited resources that are in our soils. Some plants even toxify the surrounding soil, making conditions less favorable for our native species. And that process is called allelopathy. And so things like yellow star thistle, dyer's woad, and other plants like that will actually make conditions in the soil, even if you have a bunch of natives in the area that can provide seed, that seed won't germinate because the soil has been toxified by those. Another reason why some of our species are invasive is they lack natural predators or pests or disease. So when the species were brought over, the pathogens or anything that kept it in check was not brought over. Additionally, they'll have higher growth rates, though. Case in point with the blackberry, they'll grow extremely fast, especially compared to some of our natives outcompeting them for sunlight. And along with that, we also have invasive species that are very of high quality seed, which basically means they will put out a lot of seed and a lot of seed that actually sprouts into new species. So these are some of the reasons why we'll call a species invasive. And so for a full list of all of Oregon's noxious invasive species, I have a link down here, and this PowerPoint recording will be provided later, but that's a link to all of the invasive species list in Oregon through the Oregon Department of Ag. So here are some invasive species. Some dyer's woad out at one of our project sites. It's little yellow flowers. Just brought in, usually it was used as a dye back in the day. So a lot of invasives weren't even brought, it wasn't intentionally brought in to be malicious. Sometimes, people try to do good and accidents happen, but we're got to still try to, correct that. Here's a bunch of garlic mustard out at a different site. It's a really problematic invasive species in the riparian areas in certain areas. And also poison hemlock. So this talk's going to be mainly on blackberry, but poison hemlock will come up quite a bit because they like to be associated with each other during the process of completing treatments. And we'll get into why that is a little bit later. But here's a picture of some of the poison hemlock, and they'll end up getting another 8 feet tall or so. They'll get up to 15 feet tall, but it's a poisonous plant, both the livestock and humans, and yeah, just not good to deal with. And then the star of the show today, blackberry. So here's 2 sites that are filled with blackberry. These sites have since been treated and actually look nothing like that, but that's what a pretty intense blackberry infestation can look like in a riparian area. And as you can see, other than the mature trees that likely sprouted before the blackberry came in, there is no other trees or canopies or anything attempting to break through that. And so that goes back to our invasive species suppress our natives. Blackberry in particular will completely outshade any seeds or seedlings to where they can't even get the opportunity to grow. And in these instances, the seeds can't even make it to the ground just because of the density of the thickets. But I do want to emphasize, at least in our area here in Southern Oregon, we do have native blackberries, and we have at least 2, which are pretty easily in general to tell apart from the invasive. As you can see here, they have cuter little kind of less pronounced thorns, and you can in a lot of cases handle these and they won't even hurt too bad, and they have these bright teal green stems. So if you are doing a blackberry treatment in your riparian area, you may come across these, and try to avoid them if you can. There's not too many of our native species of blackberry out and about, so if we can leave them alone, that's awesome. But accidents happen when you're out there trying to target a plant that looks very similar. But yeah. So treatments for blackberry. So there are obviously a bunch of different ways to treat blackberry mechanically. You can use loppers, clippers, all sorts of different tools, weed eaters, brush mowers, flail mowers. Ultimately, the goal is to get rid of and kill the plant. And you can either do that by starving the plant through stress by repeated cutting, and we'll get into what that is and what that means. And then, or you could either just cut and uproot the plant in general. And so we'll kind of go into some of the reasons why or why not to do some things, but that's our general goal, is we want to restrict this plant to where it either A, is dead or dying, or is having a hard enough time to grow that our natives will actually have the chance to outcompete. So cutting. Cutting can be done with a variety of ways: weed eaters, clippers, or large machines such as flail mowers or brush mowers. We use weed eaters for our treatments, which has what's called a brush cutter blade. There are a variety of different blades like that you can find at your local hardware store. The one we use looks like a 3-pointed ninja star. There are also blades that look like a little sort of lawnmower blade. But that's recommended if you're going to use a weed eater. I wouldn't suggest using a string trimmer. You'll probably go through a lot of string. It might work, but you'll go through a lot of string. But the general idea, regardless of how you cut the plant down, is that you want to cut it down to the ground at least 3 times a year. And because the idea here is we're trying to prevent the plant from uptaking energy through sunlight and photosynthesis to be able to put that energy into its root. And at the end of this presentation, I've got a I'll show you guys an example of what a blackberry root can turn into. But that's basically the idea. We want to have the plant utilize as much of its stored energy as possible to live while preventing it from taking more energy in. And ultimately, that'll starve the plant. So to achieve that through mechanical means, and usually this process will take, you'll see results in year 3. And by year 5, a lot of plants will already have exhausted their resources if the whole process has been kept up. And past that point, there's minimal plants left. And I know this sounds like a lot, 3 times a year for at least 3 to 5 years. The biggest thing with blackberry is the first push is the hardest and the most amount of time involved. Past that, you're literally finding plants that are sprouting up and growing. So it's a lot easier to go across the landscape, especially on most of the properties that homeowners will have or will be less than half an acre. And so the time involvement in the beginning is really where the most energy is involved. But other than that, you're basically chasing plants down. By year 3, you're looking for plants. It's not like you have to cut all of those that entire time. The involvement of effort is dramatically reduced each time you go, as long as you keep up on it and don't allow them to come back with a vengeance. So ideally, you want to cut in like key phases of the plant's growth. And so whenever you start this, doesn't necessarily matter. Obviously, the cutting in the summer when the plants are in flower can be challenging if we're in fire season. But if that can be done before fire season, that's a great opportunity. But basically, you want to get the plants in early spring as they start to emerge. Or when you're doing your first push, the time of year isn't too important. The summer and the fall treatments are better for that. In regards to the fall, if you do the first cut on all of your blackberry, there's a lot of moisture out, so it's a lot less likely for there to be some sort of instance since we're out of fire season. But additionally, since they're going into dormancy, they won't be able to bring that energy back in, and they'll be trying to heal all of those cuts you just made while trying to go into hibernation essentially. So it's very difficult to heal a bunch of cuts and wounds when it's wet, you're cold, and you're trying to go to sleep. So that's a great time to do the first cut on the blackberry. And then following that, you want to get in there in early spring when the plants start to come out of dormancy. So they put on a bunch of growth from their reserves, and then you cut them back, and they essentially have to do that again without having the opportunity to restore that. And then one of the more important times, as I said just a second ago, is during flowering. So flowering is a very energy intensive, costly part of a plant's life. So when we cut the blackberries in the middle of flowering, they've used more energy than they have during most of their growth cycle during that point. And now they have to do it again. So those are 3 of the key times to cut the plants. You can obviously cut more than that if you want to, if you have the time, and it may speed up the process. But ideally, you want to get 3, cut the plants to the ground 3 times a year. In early spring when they start to come out of dormancy, in the summer once they're in flower or going into flower, and then later fall before they go back into dormancy. Something to be mindful of with blackberries is the tips of their branches do like to try to root into the ground. So especially with bigger plants, and if you've missed a treatment and you come through and cut the plants all at the base, it's best to try to pull those and pile those branches, because in a lot of instances, they will be rooted at the end of that branch. And so you less killed the plant and more so just created a bunch of separate plants. So it's always good to try to check the end of the branches to make sure it hasn't rerooted and is creating more plants for you to take care of in the future. And so, yeah, ultimately, you're trying to have the plant spend more energy than it can replace. weed eaters versus flail and brush mowers. So we was talking about the first push, the first treatment that you want to do on blackberry is really time intensive. So using a brush or a flail mower does seem like a great idea. You get the job done, you get it done fast. There are quite a few drawbacks with that method. So the time is a benefit, but drawbacks to it are it will create significant ground disturbance, whether from the tracks or the wheels or even the head itself. And when you create a lot of ground disturbance, especially in our riparian areas, it encourages a lot of other invasive species to germinate, especially poison hemlock. And poison hemlock is an easy plant to mechanically treat, although it's toxic and you have to have the proper protective gear. Still, you don't want to replace one problem with another. So avoiding that ground disturbance is really key unless you have plans in place to essentially attack the new invasives that'll come up from that. Also, when you're using larger equipment like that, you can compact the soils, which will make them less available, so to speak, for our native species, and you can even end up disturbing that soil to an extent where it'll wash into the stream, which is ultimately what we do not want happen. So, and on top of that, when you use those equipment like that, you really can't see the fine details of where you're working, and you're more likely to accidentally remove suppressed native species, which is why I personally prefer to use a weed eater. As we go through, we can see the snowberry, the ash, the cedar that's been just hidden under those blackberries for years. And that way you have a lot of native plants that are there for you that are specifically adapted to your habitat. And so those are some of the drawbacks with using the bigger equipment. You'll create disturbance. You have a high potential of killing native species that are there on their own accord and other things, but it does speed up the process. In certain areas, if they've been highly disturbed recently, and like maybe a flood came through and it was all taken out, and then blackberries came in after the fact, there's maybe less likelihood of native species being under there, but still it's always something to be mindful of. I mean, they're specifically adapted for your riparian area. Also, as we discussed, a quick way of kind of speeding up that process is you can uproot the plants. Ideally, you still want to cut them to the ground. Makes it easier to see where the root wad actually is. Makes it easier to get to the plants and manage. This will help speed things up. There still will be, I don't think you'd be able to get them all, but repeated treatments and processes is what's needed for success here. And you can use a variety of tools. We use picks, shovels, McClouds, which is just like a giant 4-pronged kind of hoe looking tool. And basically anything you can use to get into the ground and use leverage on the root of the blackberry. But yeah, it'll still cause disturbance. Maybe not as on the scale necessarily as something like a brush or a flail mower. So there is that trade-off. But you might have invasive species come up that you're unaware of anyways throughout this process. And so it's always mindful to just pay attention to the site while you're working it, before and after, seeing what plants are there, what's doing well, different things like that. And that'll help with what we'll get into when we get into the permitting part of it. Okay. Okay, the permitting. So for both Jackson and Josephine County, you are required to fill out a riparian landscape plan. So if you are going to remove any kind of vegetation from a riparian setback area, and I'll explain what a riparian setback area is here in a second. But if you are to remove any vegetation, invasive species, native species, that doesn't matter. Any vegetation, you must complete and submit and have an approved riparian landscape plan. And so riparian landscape plans are approved by ODF&W and county planning prior to beginning your work. I spoke with Frank Drake, and he is the assistant row district fish biologist with ODF&W. His contact information is down there. Contact him throughout any part of this process. Ideally, contact him before beginning the process. Frank will be the one to review your plan and your site and have additional suggestions and tips for you that I might not present at this meeting. So I just thought I'd put his information there, and you can also find it at the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife website. Okay. So this is the basic version of the plan. I will be forwarding to the group a PDF of each county's individual plans, and you can fill those out if you have a PDF. But essentially, the first item that you need to provide is the zoning information. And so this is a map of your property and how it's zoned. This map can be provided by the county planning. So you can contact Jackson County Planning or Josephine County Planning, and they will provide that information. They will a lot of times provide that if you go in person to fill out this information. Additionally, you can go to these long-winded websites here for Josephine County and Jackson County, and those are county GIS maps. And all you have to do is type in your address, and it should pull up the zoning information for your property. And so that is something you will need to have with your riparian landscape plan when you go to turn it in. And it's just a county planning map of your property. So first off, on our plan, it asks you some general information. I'm basically going to go through the entire plan step by step to try to just answer any questions or anything. These plans aren't too long or elaborate, but they're very important. So our general information, you'd put your name, your phone number, mailing address, and then the project location or site address. So if you own 2 properties or you're managing a property for somebody else, you need to have that location for that address in the project location site address. And so additionally, you will need what's called the township, range, the section, and your tax lot. Now, if you're a property owner, you may already have this information available to you. If not, there are a variety of map resources as well as the zoning information map that can provide that for your property. And so you need to first off, just fill out this basic information. So next they ask project description. Okay, so what is the purpose for filling this plan? Well, the purpose for us, for what we're talking about, and this is just a simple example. You want to put more elaborate responses to these questions. I just want to provide just a general thought on the idea of what they're asking for. So what is the purpose for filling this plan? And our simple example is to remove invasive species and create a more resilient riparian area. Well, there's a variety of different things and reasons for you filling this plan. And so that could be a multitude of things. Well, a lot of people's concerns out here is wildfire in regards to blackberry. As we've seen from several examples in recent years, areas with blackberry act as wicks and will basically carry fire. And then very heavily inundated areas, the canes of the blackberry will go 15 plus feet up into the tree canopies, which will then lead to canopy fires. So there's a variety of reasons why you might fill out this plan. Maybe you want better access to your river area. Just whatever the reason yours is. It might not necessarily be this reason. And so next off, you would want to give them the stream or river name. So I just decided to go with the Applegate River. But that might be Bear Creek. It might be Cheney Creek. It could be any number of streams or rivers. But that's what you would put here. And so approximate length of stream and river affected. I just put 300 feet, but this will be the length along the river, the distance on your project. So is your project going across along your entire riparian area? And then what would be that measurement, or is it only part of it? Some areas aren't completely inundated with invasive species. Maybe you only have a patch here or a patch there. So you'd want to enter that information there. This next question might be confusing, is if this is a class 1 stream, identify the approximate width stream at the point the landscape plan is proposed. So this plan we're reading off is directly from Jackson County, but Josephine County's plan is very, very similar, and they almost mirror each other. So this should be applicable for both plans. Additionally, in regards to class 1 stream and the next question, state a required width of your riparian setback area. I will be forwarding the riparian setback areas for both Josephine and Jackson County that were composed by Frank Drake, as mentioned earlier, and that should cover all water bodies within the Rogue Basin. So for all of us folks who are turning in Southern Oregon, that information should be there. If you happen to fall outside of that area, I would contact your local ODFW rep or your local planning district. And so with that information, you'd be able to gather A, if it's a class 1 stream, and then B, what is our riparian setback? And so for the Applegate, it is 50 feet. So following that, it has a question to describe your basic plan regarding plant removal and replanting. So I want to emphasize replanting. It's not just enough to remove invasive species. When we do that and we don't replant, we have a lot of exposed soil and no canopy to speak of to come back. And so that leads to our issues that affect riparian areas that we spoke of earlier. If we were just to remove these species, the ground would essentially get baked during the summer and be not hospitable to any species. Aside from that, during our high rain events, a lot of that topsoil would rush into the river. And then there's nothing there in place, A, to provide shelter or habitat or food for any of our wildlife, let alone shade for our stream systems for our salmonids and other anadromous fish. So you are required to plant, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But if you are going to remove invasive species or do any treatments in your riparian area, you are required to replant that area. And then, like I said, we'll get into that a little more in a second. So here, you will basically describe your process of removal. So you might, if you decided to use a brush or flail mower, or if you decide to use a weed eater, this is where you would put that. For example, we will use weed eaters with brush cutter blades. We will cut in the spring, summer, and fall. Obviously, a little bit more detailed, but you to get the general idea. Go through your actual methods, your timing of your treatments, your approach. When do you plan on doing that? You also need to describe your planting method in this part. And so that could mean, selecting the appropriate species. All species might not be individually suited for your specific site. If there's too much sun or if there's too much shade from nearby canopies, it might constitute a different plant selection. So for your replanting, you also want to state how you're going to plant. And, like, it sounds simple, but you need to put in, digging your hole, removing competing vegetation, if you're scalping the ground before you put in your plant so it has a better chance of survival, whether or not you're going to use browse protection from deer and wildlife. You want to tell about what the timing of those things will look like. What type, is it going to be a mesh cage? Is it going to be a fence? Things like that you would want to put in here as best to your ability. So, riparian setback area. So as I said before, I will be forwarding the complete list for the Rogue Basin riparian setbacks. Additionally, it can be found at this website listed at the bottom of this slide. But the riparian setback area is the area measured from what's called the ordinary high water line. And I'll have a picture on the next slide to help kind of demonstrate this. But it is essentially the level at which the river or your stream ordinarily rises to. So in the middle of our winters, where does your river usually set? And that's apart from our historic floods. But in our area in particular, in Southern Oregon, this is usually about the riverbank. And so you'll see, our rivers are inset and then there's a bank. Our riparian setback area is usually measured from there. And each river and stream has a different setback, as we discussed, which can be found at that link. So this is kind of our photo from earlier, but as you can tell, like this might be our regular summer flows in the stream. So our ordinary high water line, where it is in the winter, is right here. And so this will be similar depending on the topography and what stream and river you're on, its size and things like that. But essentially our riparian setback area, that 50 feet we mentioned for the Applegate River, we'll measure from starting at that high water line. So that area is measured from there back. So all of this is still included in your treatments in your riparian area. But anything done within this line to the center line of the stream needs to be included in the riparian plan. If you're tackling species or doing anything past that, then you don't need to do the riparian landscape plan. So yeah, here's a good example, and you guys will be able to look at this later for reference if you need to. So next, you'll be doing the planting plan. So and they ask, does your proposal include planting new trees and or understory vegetation? Yes, it would always be yes. You must replace removed vegetation with native riparian tree and shrub species. Some people want to go and like, I love this magnolia, I love this maple, and that's fine, but you need to replant with native riparian tree species regardless. Those other species, if you like, or if you're interested in, may be able to be added later. But for this plan, for these treatments, you will use native riparian species. And so a full list of accepted species was kind of too large to put on here, but you can get that information from your local ODF and W. Also, they might have some recommendations for site-specific habitats. If you're in a valley, if you receive a lot of shade, if you're in an open plain, you should be able to get additional information that way. And there are a lot of other resources in our area, such as the soil water conservation districts and things like that, that'll have helpful information. So when you go to replant your riparian area, you're required to plant one plant for every 64 square feet of vegetation removed, which is essentially the same as planting your trees and shrubs on 8-foot centers. One tree here, 8 feet in each direction within that. And so a good way to figure that out is to take your treated area in square feet and just divide it by 64, and that'll give you a rough estimate of the number of plants you want to plant. You can plant more than that if you want. If you're gonna plant small shrubby species such as like snowberry or Oregon grape, you can always feel free to plant more than that. but you can't do less. Just wanted to emphasize that. So, and by replanting, we kind of discussed earlier, it reduces that erosion and the drying out of our newly exposed soils. It will eventually create a canopy and a seed source for new riparian species so they can get back to being in their natural cycles of growth. It helps shade the river for our sensitive fish species. And also, since they're native plants, they'll be more adept and resilient to things like wildfire and other events. West catastrophic had there been a lot of invasive species there or no plants at all from removing it. And so, yeah, it's very important and required to replant with native riparian species after you do invasive treatments in our riparian areas. So then the next question is, if you answered yes to this question, oh, I can't read it real quick. To number 4, please provide the following information. And so essentially here, it wants you to, there's a little table, and it wants you to list the species you are planting. And you can get those species from the proposed list that I suggested earlier when you reach out to your local fisheries biologist, your local watershed council. There's a lot of different resources for that. And then in this area, it wants you to put your quantity, species type, and size. So the quantity is pretty straightforward. I just gave a little example here of using 40 Oregon ash. And so it wants species. I usually put common and scientific. Not sure if that's exactly necessary. The common species might just work fine. ODF and W would be able to tell you if they're not happy about that. And then it wants to know the size of the pot, whether so it's gallon, half gallon, seedling, are they bare root? And so you will fill out that whole thing for every plant that is planned for our planting. And then it wants you to answer the area being removed is measured approximately. And so that's where you'll put our calculation that we came up with earlier to determine the number of plants. And so you'd put the square feet of the blackberry you're actually treating, not the whole riparian area, only the areas you are treating. If you're not touching any of the plants in a specific spot of your riparian area, it doesn't need to be included. And then on the next question it wants, what's the species common name? So it wants to know the invasive species common name that you're treating. And for example, we're going to use blackberry, or we could say Himalayan blackberry or Armenian blackberry, or a variety of things, Dyer's woad, garlic mustard. So you don't need the scientific information for that. Just have an idea of what species you're trying to target. Okay. And so then it asks for a maintenance plan, right? You can't just throw plants in the ground and expect everything to be okay. So when you're doing these, it'll ask yes or no, are you proposing a maintenance plan? You will be proposing a maintenance plan. So please describe that maintenance plan. Like I said, you're required to have a maintenance plan to ensure both the success of your treatments, so the removal of your invasive species, along with your plantings, so the health and survival of your plantings. So your maintenance plan must include supplemental watering or irrigation for the new plantings. Whether that's an irrigation system, whether that's you going out there with a hose a few days a week, getting the kids to get 5-gallon buckets of water out of the river. The plantings need to be irrigated and to a point where they can survive on their own. A lot of these areas we just opened up by removing the invasive species. There are still going to get hot and dry, and those conditions might not be exactly suitable in the initial phases of that plant's life, especially with just being transplanted. So you are required to irrigate the plantings until you can wean them off. So as part of your maintenance plan, you'll include what methods you're going to use, and then how are you going to take them off of that irrigation as well. And you can get and you can get helpful information from different sources dependent on the species. But you want to state that here, how you're going to maintain them, weaning them off of the water. And you also want to put in here the maintenance plan and strategy for your invasive species. So are you going to repeatedly cut 3 times a year at these specific times? Are you just going to cut the first year and then remove some of the root balls and cut the rest? Whatever your plan is to ensure the success of this project, you will want to include that in this section. And so then it asks proposed date of vegetation removal. That, you just got to let the county know when you plan on starting this project, whether it's in this, March of 2025 or whenever that might be, and then when the vegetation will be replaced by. And so you will replace the vegetation the first year, usually, that you remove the invasive species. And be mindful of when you do your planting and when you do your cutting. Our natives typically like to be planted following between November and as late as May, depending on the species, during their dormancy months. So plan for planting in the winter months and when you might want to do your vegetation removal to complement that. If you have the time and you have the ability and you can, get the plants down in summer, let the summer sun scorch them a little bit, do another treatment in the fall, and then come in and plant, that would be ideal. But here is where you will put those 2 dates on when you're going to do your first treatment and when you're going to plant following treatment. And then one of the last questions it asks is, what is your justification for impacting the riparian setback area? And this is almost a rehashing of the question from earlier as to why you're doing this, but here is where you'll justify to ODF&W and the county on why you want to do these. What is your goal, essentially? What is the why? Are you trying to do this because you want to bring in a specific type of wildlife or, pollinator, or you're worried about wildfire risk, or you want to improve habitat quality in a variety of ways? And it could be a bunch of different reasons, but this is the section where you will put your reasoning for why you want to do these treatments. And then last, it'll ask, and this part's a little confusing, but we'll get to it. Did you create a landscape plan for approval by ODF&W on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper? If so, yes. If not, you have to create one before you set up your appointment. So essentially, the landscape plan is a visual representation of your project. And I have an example of one that I've made in the past on the next slide. Things you'll want to include: where the river's at or the stream. Put a name to it if you can. Key features, if there are any, if you have like a road or a trail or a path or a large boulder, something along those lines, and you'll want to put that in your landscape plan. And then where and what species will be planted. So I usually will put actually the individual plants as a dot, and I'll show you guys an example on the site on where I'm going to plant it. Draw out your irrigation layout if you can, or if you have an idea of how that's going to go in. And if you're feeling real good about your knowledge of your property, you could even, color code the soil types or any if you want. But essentially, you want to have at least the key features: the river, the riparian area itself, where the plants are going to go, and that kind of information. Additionally, it's good to have like location information, such as your address, a key if you denoted anything that wasn't too obvious. And it's nice to put a northerly orientation on the map, so the county and ODFW, when they go to review it, can have a better perspective on what they're looking at. And so here's a general example, not too complicated. I guess you can make it really complicated if you want. But here's a general example of a riparian zone. It doesn't look like you can see it all in this slide, but you can see I have a road drawn there, the Applegate River. You can't see it on here in the share screen, but I drew a compass showing north, and I did a key up here in the top, which has all of the species that I plan to use. So you see maple, mock orange, nine bark, dogwood, ash, snowberry, Oregon grape. And so I just did those each in a different colored pencil and put them on this plan exactly where I plan to plant them. And I differentiated off to the side the different soil zones. This area in particular is really flat between 1 and 2, and then has a steep uphill. And so I just kind of wanted to denote that in this plan. Additionally, at the top, it has the address and also the section, township, and range. And so after you get this created in however form you wish to do it, that's generally what they're wanting for the landscape plan on an 8.5 by 11 is a visual representation of your project. A way to see what's actually going to happen on the ground, what you've written, put into a visual context. Nobody's judging you on your art, so don't feel too pressured. I'm sure this riparian, this river edge I drew here isn't exactly to scale. And so after that, you're finished, which is awesome. So once you've completed all of that in the riparian landscape plan, you're going to want to contact the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. Frank Drake, whose information was there at the front, he'll be the one to review your plan. He may ask to see the site or have one of the other biologists come out and see the site prior to the project or following the project. Just to make sure if anything, have any suggestions to make your life easier or different plants like that. They're very resourceful and very helpful over there. After you get ODF and W's approval and signed off on your plan, you have to take that plan to whichever planning department you're in the county of, either Jackson or Josephine County planning. And then you'll have to pay a filing fee, which I don't remember off the top of my head and may be different in each county, but I don't believe it's very much at all. It's, but you pay your filing fee. They'll see that the ODF and W has signed off on your project. They'll sign off on your project, and then you're good to move forward. It's a few little steps, but it's all for a very important outcome. And you know, there's a good reason for it. Like, we all want to help out there, and it's good to try to help in a manner that's, you know, beneficial and productive. And that's all there is to the riparian plan. Once you've got that done, you've got your signatures, you've paid your filing fee, they'll give you the go ahead to start your project. And then you're good to go. Once again, I really want to thank everybody for your interest in helping making our riparian areas more resilient and healthier. Like I said earlier on, they're such a small part of our ecology and our ecosystems as a whole, but they play a big outsized role, more so than a lot of people are aware. And yeah, their effects on both the upland and the aquatic species is beneficial for all of us, not just our wildlife, but us as well, having these healthier riparian areas, preventing pollutants from getting into our water, whether that's groundwater or rainwater. Our enjoyment of our riparian areas. I mean, if they're all full of blackberry, you can't even go to see the pretty plants or anything cool like that. So once again, just thank you all for your interest in this, and I hope this is helpful in navigating the permitting process and things like that. If you're in the Applegate watershed, I am more than willing to help assist with any questions. Even outside of the watershed, I could probably still assist with your questions, but I might not be as knowledgeable for your specific site. And so think that's it, and I will take questions.
Wonderful. All right, let's see. Let me just get back to our chat.
Oh, and one last thing. I'm sorry,
Oh,
Nicole.
yeah,
I have
you're
to
going to
show
show the
this.
blackberry, right?
Yeah, so I was out the other day and thought you guys might be interested to see how big some of the blackberry roots can actually get. So this is where the plant comes out of the ground, and this is all of the underground structure. They're not all like this. This was a very old blackberry that had been at that site for a very long time. But sometimes when you're trying to remove the root, that might be what you're dealing with. And so it's always good to be careful in those situations, even with a pick or a shovel and you're leveraging. There's shallow roots, but they will give and it might throw you backwards. So it's always good if you're going about it that process to just be mindful of your surroundings and that you might be tackling a root like that.
Yeah, that is gnarly. I'll read out, there's some questions, some comments, there's some conversation going on.
Awesome. I
I'll
have,
read them out just so that we have them, because I don't save the chat that way for the recording.
okay.
Mike mentioned he has a lot of poison hemlock at his project site, seems to show up after clearing blackberry.
Yep. So poison hemlock will, I see the same thing at our sites. Loves to come up after the blackberry. A lot of that has to deal with exposing that ground and the sunshine. They really like the sun, but also that disturbance we were talking about earlier. Um, and so, but poison hemlock, if you have the proper PPE, goggles, a respirator, gloves, and things like that, when it's small, it's a carrot. It's really easy to just hand pull as long as you avoid contact with it. And even when they get really large like that, with a post shovel, it's real easy to get that root and just wrench it out of the ground. Like I said, they have a big carrot like stem. They are a biennial, so they will grow a little bit the first year, and then the next year is when they get really, really tall and actually start blooming and things like that. Ideally, you don't want to cut that mechanically. Obviously, you're more likely to get the plant residues on you, but it likes to grow back after it's cut, and you'll lose the flowers sometimes in the tall grasses when that happens. Ideally, if you do want to attempt to cut it, like I said, you have to be safe and wear the proper PPE, but you would like to cut it right below the root crown when it's in full flower. That'll kill the plant, it'll prevent it from going to seed, and it prevents it from sprouting to form new flowers. Otherwise, you're just creating a bunch of tiny problems.
Gotcha.
That's it.
Is there a resource that you recommend for plant identification? I don't trust my memory to be able to tell the difference between native and the Himalayan blackberry. A few of us responded with a few apps that we like to use, Seek and iNaturalist, which is Seek is a version of iNaturalist. And Jeff also added in how the native blackberry is close to the ground and stringy vines, small tasty berries, blue-green vine, about 1/8 of an inch. Do you have any other identification sources you like to use?
Not that I can think of. I will sometimes have books with me, but after the recent update, Seek has been a lot better than it was in the past. They just recently updated, and it's been really good about a lot of plants I've been coming across, just kind of testing it out to see how well it'll do. So that is a good resource. And then if you have any questions, like somebody said earlier, you could put it up on iNaturalist. There are a lot of us that are trying to use iNaturalist also to see what invasive species people are finding, regardless if they realize they're invasive or not, to get an idea of where some of these plants are on the landscape. Um,
Yeah.
And I prefer iNaturalist because I also like contributing to scientific data, and I like
yep.
that feature of it for scientists that are tracking.
I like
And
to find rare flowers, and Seek isn't happy about those.
nice. And Mike shared a photo and some native blackberry that he was able to rescue from a blackberry thicket, and that real pretty teal that you were talking about.
Yeah, they're really pretty. Once you get an eye for them, they're hard to miss. But if you're just out there swinging your weed eater and stuff, it's kind of hard to pay attention. You're sweaty, you're getting cut. You're like, oh no. Oh, also something that's neat about the invasive blackberry. Predominantly, all of their thorns point back towards the base, right? So if you're I like to pull it out of the trees after I cut it. Obviously, you don't want a bunch of dead canes up in the trees still causing ladder fuels, but you can pull it if you pull away from the tip. Essentially, you're a lot less likely to get thorns in your gloves or your hand. If you pull from the tip or in that direction, any part of the vine, you're gonna get all of the thorns. So they back curve towards the base or the root of the plant, which is really handy in ripping it out and pulling it out of things without injuring yourself.
One of those hints from someone that's been doing a lot of blackberry removal. Let's see. Charles noted another handy gadget for blackberry eradication is something called a puller bear, heavy duty steel construction that helps lever the crown roots out of the soil. Loppers plus shovel plus the puller bear has been his go-to.
Yep.
And
there's I can find this card. There's a gentleman in, I think, Grants Pass who recently invented this tool that we've been trying out, and it's called like the uprooter or something, but it's the same type of mechanism. It's like a T-post puller, but for blackberry. And yeah, that's also really good. You're going to create a lot less disturbance with that because you're not throwing something into the ground to rip it up. You're just grabbing onto the base of the plant and using leverage. I'm not sure, but that might work on the poison hemlock too. I've never tried it, but I would assume that it could work for that. Yeah, the uprooter. Thank you.
Yeah.
Cool. That's exactly what it's talking about.
And I think that might also be during the spring garden fair for the master gardeners, we have some folks come out with similar tools. I wonder if it's the same uprooter folks. They are quite.
Yeah, we're starting to have our students, when we do our stewardship and on hands like work and stuff, using them, and it seems to be working pretty well. Yeah, so they're a variety, and like I said earlier, this is for mechanical treatments. We as an organization don't use herbicide, so I can't comment on it, but there are resources in our area, and maybe Nicole, you might know more about that than I, on if you want to approach it that way. And I don't know what that looks like in the permitting process. So I don't know what kind of different things that might add to the permitting process than what we went over. There might be a lot more involved in regards to your timing, permitting, just a lot of different things. So I just want to throw that out there, that there are resources out there. I can't think of any off the top of my head because I don't use them. But if you are interested in that, yeah, it might make the process a little more complicated.
I would imagine ODF and W would have that information. I know there are licensed people, but I don't know anything more.
Right. Yeah, and I didn't talk to any of the licensed applicators I know before this, so I can't really make any suggestions. Also, something I want to bring up in regards to implementing this. Okay, so we've talked about doing the permitting, we talked about the plan. What about the cost, right? Some of this effort, if you're paying somebody to do it, even use of your own fuel and things like that can be costly and might put some of this work outside of what some landowners and homeowners can accomplish. There are a variety of programs in our area that can help with offset some of those costs. The Jackson County Soil Water Conservation District has a riparian rebate program. It is competitive, and a lot of these programs might be competitive, but if there are financial constraints or anything concerned with this, there are organizations out there that may be able to help. Likewise, if you're in the Applegate watershed, I may be able to help with certain grants or different things like that to help the restoration project. So don't be necessarily perturbed by thinking about those costs, or if it is something to concern, there are programs that have the ability to help. It's not guaranteed that you'll get into them. Like I said, some of them are competitive, but there are programs out there at least that are worth trying to get your hands on if financial response or is a bit of a limitation.
I'm from Amber. So a bank full is the same thing as an ordinary high water line, right?
Generally speaking, yeah. I'm sure there's some inside streams, which basically is a river channel that's cut itself really deep into a valley that doesn't quite apply to, but I don't think there's too many areas necessarily like that in our area. But yeah, generally speaking, it's the riverbank. A good example is, I mean, here recently, if you're with a lot of the water we've been having lately, is a good indicator for your own area, to be able to tell where the ordinary high water line is, give or take, depending on where you're at, maybe like 6 inches from what it sits right now, maybe even where it's at right now, is a good indicator to have a starting determination. And then, like I said, that riparian area setback is marked from that back. So if your stream has a setback of 25 feet, it'd be 25 feet back from that line. So all vegetation from that to the river is counted as your riparian plant. And so anything past whatever the setback is, whether it's 50 feet or on the main stem rogue, it's 75 feet in certain areas. On smaller streams and non-fish bearing streams, it could be as small as 25 feet of a setback, but that includes everything from the ordinary high water line down if you're going to be doing work in that area.
Are you allowed to remove invasives in the stream?
Ooh, aquatic invasive species. Now that is something we'd all love to do. We want to, and we're all interested in, and some of us can. If you find aquatic invasive species, I would suggest contacting Carrie Perosco at ODA Noxious Weeds. She is our invasive species coordinator for the Oregon Department of Agriculture. And a lot of us are working on, and there's actually the new RAIN, which is the Rogue Aquatic Invasives Network, which was just started by ODA and a few of us out here to find and address a lot of those aquatic invasive species, like yellow floating heart and Ludwigia, yellow primrose, yellow flag iris, a lot of yellow flowers. But yes, if you do have any examples of that, I would suggest letting ODA know about that, and they'd be able to put you in hands with somebody that can help you with those treatments. Those are pretty important species that we'd like to take care of. And so, and they have very dramatic consequential effects on our watersheds and systems. I mean, I know this meeting isn't for that, but that's a great question.
Are there any restrictions to where you can purchase your native species for replanting?
That's a good question. ODFW in the county would like you to, as best as possible, source it from local nurseries. Especially a lot of the local small nurseries and nonprofit nurseries have local plant stock derived from plants in our area. Some species aren't always available. You know, certain species of certain sizes aren't always available. Also, in these riparian plants, in our plant list, try to pick at least, I didn't mention this, at least 4, if not more, different species if you can, to create diversity. Don't just plant all, incense cedar or all Oregon ash. Diversity is the spice of life, And so try to get at least a good 4 species in there if you can have them available to you. And ideally, if there aren't any stocks available, there's shortages and stuff, you can bring in native species that are from not local. There's issues that arise from that, like a ponderosa pine that's found here and a ponderosa pine that's found in Eastern Oregon. That one might be heat tolerant, which we might be going into warmer conditions, but it might not be adapted to the fungus or all these other little things in the site that ponderosa is adapted to. So you do kind of run a risk of, survivability, introducing genetics and things like that. But in the end, we want these areas to be healthy. We can't always get what we want. And then getting the invasives off of the landscape and replacing it with natives is better than doing nothing at all, when it comes down to it. So ideally, try to get local source plant stock, but there's situations in which that isn't always possible.
And I did share in the chat, because I'm a master gardener there, we do have our spring garden sale coming up the first weekend of May. And we sell native plants, and we'll be at the expo in the Mace building this year. And then the following weekend, the Saturday of Mother's Day, we have an after sale where we sell whatever's left of our vegetables, but also a bunch of natives, usually at a discounted rate. So that's
Is that with PPRV?
No, just through the Jackson County Master Gardeners Association.
Oh, that's awesome. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like there's a lot of different resources. We have the Pollinator Project of Rogue Valley. We have the Understory Initiative. There's a lot of sources for seed. There's a variety of smaller organizations out here that are ag irrigation ponds subject to permit requirements. That's a good question. Depends on where the pond's at.
Probably a Jackson Soil and Water Conservation District.
Yeah, that's a soil water conservation district question, because it depend on a lot of things that are beyond my purview. That's a good question.
I'm going to continue on. We've got quite a bit more up here near the middle of this session. Do you suggest the half gallon to the gallon sizes, since the gallon would be more expensive, and thinking about them giving the native plant a better chance of survival? What do you suggest between those two?
I like that. I use bare roots and I'll use plugs and stuff. It takes a little bit longer for the results, but a plant that's lived in a pot and it's that big, it's been in that pot, it's been pampered for a few years with all these fertilizers or whatever they use, and also it's root bound. So yeah, exactly. Planting gallon size or bigger than that, you'll get a bigger plant to begin with, but it's a higher cost. The likelihood of it surviving, depending on how much you want to pamper it, goes up. It's more likely to die, given if you neglected it. And also back to irrigation of your plants and stuff like that. You don't want to keep them on irrigation indefinitely. It's not a garden. It's not a farm. It's basically to just give them a chance to establish themselves, to be able to take care of themselves. So your irrigation, depending on your size of your plant and their needs, it might be, once a week or so. In the very hot summer months, maybe twice a week, and then you wean it off to once a week in the next year, and then maybe a half hour as opposed to an hour of irrigation. But you want to slowly get them to where they can handle the current conditions. But yeah, I agree. Especially if you're funding strapped and limited, planting those bigger plants isn't necessarily your best option. Especially like if you're going with something like a sambuca or an oak, because they just don't do well in pots in general, and so transferring them at that age is just a super stressful transition. So yeah, that's a good point. Planting smaller plants is probably going to lead to a higher likelihood of survival, and also you can plant more of them if you want. Like I was saying earlier, things like snowberry and Oregon grape, they usually come in little plugs, maybe little 4-inch pots, and so now you can plant like 16 of those for the price of 2 gallon-sized pots. And so, yeah, use that to your advantage, but you know, there's always trade-offs. Yeah, accidents happen, things happen. We have random fires of drought or heat domes. The heat dome a few years ago really affected a lot of people's plantings, regardless of what they're doing. And so things happen. And that's what's part of that maintenance part of that question and that maintenance plan. We want to ensure the survival. Are you going to try to replace any of the plants if they all die? You know, what are your strategies to the success of this plant? So that's a great point.
Speaking of irrigation, can you irrigate from the river stream that you're planting alongside of?
Ooh, if you have water rights.
Okay.
If you, yeah, you have to have the water rights, and that's also a question for the water master or ODF&W or county planning.
Okay. Is a formal plan or permit necessary for seasonal creeks and streams?
It's a tough one because a lot of our major rivers are running dry these years. If it's fish bearing, definitely. If not, like if it's like a tier 3, which is basically like a really tiny trickle that sometimes comes out of the ground every once in a while, probably not. I would confirm that with ODF&W. They'd be able to tell you how much of a concern that is.
And is that who you would confirm the class of your stream,
Yep.
creek, or river with? Is ODF?
Yeah, ultimately they're the main sign off on this plan. Even though it goes through the county planning department, it has to be approved by the ODF&W first. Because of salmon. Once again, when we went back to what we were talking about improving our riparian areas, a lot of it comes back down to salmon, and you know, it's fish, but it has a salmon, lamprey, all those, they have an outsized impact on our area, aside from, you know, fishing and economics and stuff like that. Just on an ecological standpoint, they're very important. So yeah, that's why all of this has to be approved through ODF&W, and any little nuance questions like that, like seasonal streams, or a stream that only flows once every 2 years, but when it does, this happens. Those little subtleties you'd want to clear with them. In certain cases in our area, I'll go out and survey the area first, and can sometimes make a determination, but ultimately they're the final decider on stuff like that. So if you have any like things that seem questionable to you, like this or that, it's always just good to ask. They're there to help. When I was talking to Frank before this, he was telling me to have anybody who wants to start the process, to maybe even give him a call before you start the process. They're there to answer questions. Nobody's here to fight back or against anybody. We all want this work to happen, but we want to make sure it's done right. And so that they're there to support and help you as well in this process.
A question from Rick. Is it realistic to get this permit in time to do 3 cuttings this year? What kind of turnaround time do you think it is?
We're in April, depending on the size of your property. If you started on this, got in contact with Frank by Friday or so, managed to get it all done, yeah, you could do your first cut in late May, early May. Depending on what kind of fire season we're in, get to them in July or so. At that point, we might just be in general restrictions, so you'd still be able to operate until 1 or so. And then you'd definitely be able to get your fall treatment in. And I'd say that'd probably be good for like a almost February planting or November planting at that point. That'll give you the opportunity to keep up on the blackberry without them overtaking the native plantings and keeping everything in check, especially if you've gotten those first 3 cuts initially in.
Nice.
But I think there'd be enough time. Yeah, if you started on the process. I sent forward the PDFs I sent for, they're fillable, the permits. There's a few things you have to do that are outside of that PDF, like the zoning from the planning department. and the links that we showed there on how to get that or call the planning for the zoning on your property, and the landscape plan, which was the visual representation. So aside from those 2 items, everything is just in that fillable PDF. The Jackson County one is 4 pages. 2 pages of it is just kind of information. And the Josephine County one's just 2 pages. And it's everything we just went over. They're pretty simple and straightforward. They just want to see that you know what you're doing and why you're doing it, essentially. So I think there's plenty of time for you to get that in and get at least 3 cuts in.
Nice.
You get that first one in, you're ahead of fire season already. So that's gotta feel good.
It's an extra win right there.
Yeah.
From Mike about pulling water, assuming that you're allowed to pull, he was asking if anyone had any pumps or devices you might recommend for pulling water efficiently during those summer months. And Jeff mentioned that he uses a diaphragm pump C-flow with an old car battery that's enough to pump 12 feet upwards. If one has water rights, do you have any advice on pumps to get that water?
Well, and so like a lot of my projects are sometimes like 30 or 40 acres. So I'm trying to think on small scale. Something for like a half acre or something like that. You'd only be, what is that, only less than 200 plants to be watering. You really don't need too powerful of a pump for those smaller projects. A lot of pumps, you could just, there's some math involved. On bigger sites, I usually use like the 5 horsepower Honda, but that's for like several acres of like thousands of plants. But no, I don't have too many suggestions. Usually if you have a water right, you already have a pump on your stream, or if you're on the irrigation ditch. But it also depends on what your right specifies.
Okay.
So all of that, yeah, is all the water right stuff is complicated. Especially in Southern Oregon.
And again, that's a Jackson Soil Water Conservation District sort of question, and they
Yep.
might have pump recommendations
Yeah,
too.
they would have that. Or if you're part of an irrigation district, the chair of your irrigation district would have that, if there's a semblance of organization and stuff. So it depends on what your water right is, how it's utilized. Some are just for flood irrigation, some are for specific areas of specific properties. Likewise, Soil Water Conservation District should be able to help with that. ODF&W might be able to help with some of that. But yeah, water rights out here are complicated.
Okay. For the map, do you need the linear feet of treatment on the map?
You don't need it, but you can put it on there. Just as a visual aid.
Okay.
It's not necessary, but it's any information you feel is helpful is probably helpful.
Okay. From Rick, do the cutting plant material need to be removed? I'm assuming that's related to the blackberries, or maybe just any invasive removal from your riparian area?
With the blackberries, is if they're not gotten to the point where their tips are rooting back into the ground, I'll usually just mulch them in place. It's a good way. The blackberries in general aren't going to re-root unless they already have those roots established on the tips. Also, mulching them in place adds more organic matter to your site, and it also prevents, if there's a rain or something that comes through, all that soil doesn't get washed away. So that's some of the downsides of removing all of the vegetation that you've cut, is now you have all this exposed ground. And depending on where we're at in the year, that could be very bad for you and the river. You don't want to lose all your soil, So personally, I like to mulch it in place. If the branches that begin to rip out and tip, I will pull them completely and pile them and mulch them. But certain other species, like things like Dyer's woad and other species of that, it depends on where it is in its life cycle. Certain plants are shade intolerant. So even if they're in flower and they haven't gone to seed, you can throw them under a bush and they'll never sprout because they don't like the shade. But other species, you can pull it and you might think it's okay and the whole thing goes to seed. So that's really species specific, and on some of them, time of treatment specific. This riparian plan is not just for blackberry, which is a good point. It's for, as I brought up in the beginning, if you are removing any vegetation from that riparian area, you need to fill out that plan. So whether that's blackberry, whether that's Dyer's woad, English ivy, it doesn't matter. If it's a plant and you plan on doing something with it, you have to complete that plan. So we just went over the nuances of blackberry because a lot of people in our area is one of their main concerns, but especially with the fuels and suppression and things like that. But there are other invasive riparian species that you should try to treat as well at these sites or at your sites if you come across them. The full list of ODA noxious weeds was linked earlier in the presentation as well. So yeah, depends on the species. Blackberry's fine to just mulch in place though. Like I said, I prefer it to save the soil from erosion or from wind, rain, just getting cooked, things like that.
Jeff mentions how awesome ODF and W was. They came out to our property and helped identify issues we were having. Our person pointed out red buried elder that can be cut and stuck in the mud and will regrow as a repopulation method. Any other natives we can do that with?
Okay, so the willow is a great example. And we actually have students, we plant thousands and thousands of willow cuttings. So willow naturally has cloning hormone in it, like endobutyric acid. So you can cut the stem and put it in the ground. If it's in contact with water, it may or may not sprout roots. I'll plant thousands of them. So even if the ones that don't sprout roots, they're fine. But they can be, just a few inches. They don't, as long as they're in the wet and the ground, they'll sprout. But other species you can do that with are red twig dogwood, the Cornus stolonifera, really pretty, vibrant tree, very red. You'll see it. Its roots love just traveling through the river systems. You'll see that a lot on some of our main stems. You can cut and also add those. They'll clone that way. Tall Oregon grape. Sometimes you're out there, you might accidentally cut an Oregon grape. Depending on time of year and conditions, you can just stick it right back in the ground and it can start a new plant. Cottonwoods. There are a few different species that you can do that with. Just sprout from cutting, which is pretty cool.
Nice.
Me personally, if I accidentally cut any native plant when I'm out there, snowberry, whatever, as long as it ain't a conifer or something, I'll just stub it in the ground. Because why not? It's worth a try, right? You never know. I wouldn't be surprised if mock orange and 9-bark do that, but I can't confirm it.
Okay, I see a question from Christopher. I think you already have addressed that you didn't have a lot of information on. It says after initial vegetation removal, which can be monumental, are you opposed to spot spraying with systematic herbicides that could minimize further treatment? Digging can cause unnecessary soil disturbance.
So yeah, like I said before, we don't spray herbicides. I attend a lot of the seminars and meetings with the applicators, but I'm not really apt to answer that. Once again, I'm not sure what ODF and W's stance is in regards to that. I think there might be approved methods and treatments through approved applicators.
Okay.
And as stated before, that might open up a whole different process in this permitting. Just with timing your methods, licensing, permitting, things like that I'm unaware.
Okay. Do you
But
suggest?
I was going to say they should be able to suggest you in the right direction or give you an answer straight away.
Okay, great. Do you suggest mulching around new plantings to keep soil moisture content and also suppress other non-desirable plants?
Yeah, so how I usually will go and plant after we remove our invasive species, I'll come through with my cloud and kind of scalp the area around, because it's usually a lot of like invasive mustards and different things like that, filiary stuff, things that aren't noxious invasive weeds, but they're not native. And then we'll plant our plants. And yeah, I love using mulch around the new plantings. That's an excellent way to maintain moisture, especially during those hot summer months. You don't have to irrigate as often. And as it breaks down, it gives them that nice little organic layer to kind of feed into. So mulching around your plants is a great way of doing things. And if you're already doing these treatments, and if you have the ability to, like if you have a lot of down dead wood, or in your uplands on your upper property, if a tree's recently died and you had to bring it down, chip it. And add those chips to your riparian area, add them to your plantings. It's a great way to use what you have on site and to improve the livelihood of those plants. Yeah, so I think that's a great recommendation.
Nice. From Tom, do you have any experience with reed canary grass? And if so, what resources would you suggest?
Reed canary grass is a bane. Um, so I encounter it quite a bit. I haven't found a treatment that exactly works in it. My method, I just cut it down through to the roots as far as I can get with my like brush cutter. And then I plant ashes and other trees inside of that. They're shade intolerant. My hope is, maybe in 15, 20 years, we'll generate enough shade to have an impact on that. But as it stands, canary grass is, just a difficult species to work with. And they're, from my talks with other restoration practitioners, it's a difficult species to treat. And yeah, so I don't have any suggestions on that one. Try to grow something nearby to shade it out. And it's a long-term strategy. You might not see results for a bit, but it's hopeful.
Hey, that's something.
Yeah.
From Jeff, Caleb, I second the heat island that gets generated from too much removal. We have a half-acre flail mode area and another that was just cut 3 times a year to push back the edge of the blackberry back 5 feet at a time. The grass filled into the area way better than the mass flailed area after 2 areas. 100% grass coverage with slow removal versus the spotty coverage with the flail mower.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Like, our organization used to use a flail mower before I took over in 2020 in the riparian areas, and it's a really fast way of getting things done. But like you said, with that ground disturbance, it just creates all sorts of different conditions. And like we were saying earlier, there still can be natives under that blackberry layer. You'd be surprised at how many trees are just struggling under there. And when you use a flail mower, you'll lose those. And back to, not all plants are always available to us. If we can keep any plants that are there, that's the best opportunity for us, for the future of that project. We always need to replant, but any natives that we can retain that weren't doing good, it's amazing what the response is of some of our species after they've finally been let go of all this suppression and able to actually get light and energy and not be in competition with something. So yeah, flail mowers, they're good on blackberry treatments in the upland. If you're on a farm, dairy farm, grass farm, any of that, there's already been so much disturbance created that you're not really adding to the problem in the uplands. But the riparian area is different. They haven't been as, manipulated and stuff like that to the extent as some of like the pastures. So yeah, flail mower is great. Brush mowers are great in the uplands. There's likely not any natives in that, and the ground's already been disturbed. But in the riparian areas, you can use them. It's not a preferred method. Yeah, speed isn't always your best ally.
I know we've gone over quite a bit, but I see some more
Fine.
questions in here. Are you okay with keep chugging along?
I love questions. Yeah.
All right. It looks like Maxine answered Jeff's question about a native buttercup ground cover, Western buttercup, and even included the scientific name. Thank you, Maxine.
Yeah.
And Mike's asking about the yellow flag iris festation along his riverbank. If you have any advice for mechanical removal for an army of one.
Yeah, so I haven't had to treat yellow flag iris too much in my area, but I know a few property owners that had to deal with it. Depending on how long the infestation's been, obviously you probably see a lot of their rhizomes popping up out of the surface. it's kind of a more meticulous effort, but you want to try to get as much of that rhizome as possible. Because I'm not sure what your area looks like, but they'll eventually stack on top of each other to an extent where they'll choke off the stream. And so I'm trying to think if it spreads via its roots though, breaking it when you go to do that. I'm gonna say I don't have all of the information for you on that. I would suggest taking your time with the removing of it and trying to get as much of that underground stem as possible. And past that, I can't really suggest anything off the top of my head.
Okay. And then I see Jeff has a variety of tools he likes to use, a lopper over the shoulder, some pruners in hand, machete, long cheap machete, and a variety of electric mowers to get the job done. So I appreciate a lot of folks are sharing their own experience as well. And I see a lot of thank yous from the presentation. Are irrigation ditches included as a riparian area? I think.
I don't think so. I've never, to my knowledge, anytime I treat blackberry in my upland projects along any of the irrigation ditches, that is no. But there are some irrigation ditches that run parallel to our streams and would be still within the riparian setback area. Once again, yeah, one of our other managers with the partnership works with our irrigators a lot more than I do. But I would, yeah, if you know you're not in a riparian setback area from an actual river or stream, I would feel pretty safe about that decision on your end. Also talk to your president of the irrigation district, see what their thoughts are. A lot of times some districts might put together a whole plan for the ditch. And sometimes there's additional funding that can be had through grants, either from Soil Water Conservation District or there's quite a few other sources. And if you reach out to some of the nonprofits, ditch work especially, if a lot of the people who are a part of the ditch association are on board, some of those projects are kind of easier to get funded if there's consensus. Whether it's a riparian area, if you're out of the riparian setback of an actual stream or river, I would assume no, but it's always best to double check. It's a quick phone call to get a quick no or yes, as opposed to somebody seeing what you're doing, reporting you, getting fined, and then having to go through all of this stuff. It's just so much easier just to make a simple phone call to ODF&W and get a yes. Yeah. Always best to be safe with the riparian area and permitting.
Okay, and I see a question about where to find local ODFW contact for Polk County. It looks like Jeff gave some advice on how to search website. I linked the local and regional offices on ODFW,
Oh, cool.
so hopefully that helps.
And I'm not sure if this process is the same in other counties. I guess I could assume they are, but I'm hopeful that it's generally similar. So I didn't even think about this, people being from outside of our area, but yeah, more than likely you could find the riparian landscape plan for your county through probably your local ODF&W or county planning office. Sometimes it's just as simple as riparian landscape plan for your county, and you might luck out and get what you need on the first bit. Otherwise, yeah, reach out to those two organizations and they should be able to let you know what that process is. But hopefully this helps with those permits as well, if that is the case.
Good. Peter noted that they had a couple of riparian restoration on the main stem of the Applegate below the dam. Oops, as I'm reading it, it jumped away. Oh, you can get temporary water rights from the Army Corps, and they used a 1 horsepower Harbor Freight gas pump, sized it to a drip system. They last long enough to establish the plantings.
Yep, that's how I've done some of my plantings in the past on the main stem Applegate is yeah, you gotta go through the Army Corps and do a, what is it called? I'm trying to think of the permit. It's been years since I've had to do that. But yeah, it's through the Bureau of Reclamation and the Army Corps. But yeah, that's a good resource to bring up. I'm not sure if everybody would be able to get that exemption, but it's always worth a shot. For things like riparian areas, since it's not an agricultural or an industrial or any kind of use like that, or even a personal use, realistically, the water is returning back to the stream when it's being put on the riparian area. So yeah, it's always, I forgot about that resource, and thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, reach out to the Army Corps, especially if you're in the Applegate Valley or anywhere that has like a major operational dam. They may have rebates or programs or allowances for you to irrigate off of your stream or river system for a riparian project specifically.
Okay.
Like I said, water rights are very complicated things, so it's always best to reach out before any of that. Touching the water, touching the riparian area, you want to get permission for those.
That's a good note. Let's see, Mike shared some photos of his yellow flag infestation. It looks like it's like 10 feet of yellow flag. That is intense. Jeff Burns notes Tillamook County allows 100% invasive outright, 30% removal of native, but we grow year long, nothing hanging over the creek.
Yep. Yeah. Never mind. Gonna get into some nuances of stuff, but it's not important. No, that's awesome. I was 100% invasive outright. Cool. So and also I put my contact information at the beginning, but feel free to reach out to me too, even if you're not in my area. I love talking about plants and riparian areas and just coming up with different strategies and different things. Yeah, appreciate you all for coming out, and hopefully we can get some more invasive species removed from our riparian areas. Yeah,
well, thank
we
you
all
so
benefit
much,
from it. Cool. Yeah, thank you guys.
It's great. And I'll send out the recordings sometime soon. Still working on last week's recordings, getting that out. Caleb's going to send over a PDF of his presentation and some other resources so that folks can have that available. And thank you so much for taking all your time and taking an additional 20 minutes to go through. There's a lot of questions, a lot of interest on this topic.
That was my main, feel for this is, I can sit here and talk about all of this, but it's nice to see what different questions people have in these processes and trying to figure out ways to help and stuff. So.
And Mike says, thank you. The talk helped me feel better about doing all of my work mechanically. I've heard people tell me it's futile.
They say that, don't believe them. I've got proof otherwise. Yeah, it's just a little bit more effort, but like there's a lot more reward. Everybody likes these easy strategies and stuff, and like when you do it the fast way, like we're saying, you reduce your diversity, you can reduce your genetics, you can do all sorts of just adverse things, mechanically as possible. And we need more people promoting that. Because yeah, a lot of people do think they're like, oh, this is pointless. Or I'll get, oh, what about the birds eat the blackberries? Different things like that. And it's like, well, birds grew up with like 30 different berrying species. I think they're fine without the blackberry. Well, thank you all. I guess if nobody has anything else.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you, Caleb. We appreciate you coming out and chatting with us. And everyone have a great evening.
Bye, everybody.